In other words, socialism develops by changing the economic structure that subordinates individuals and prevents their all-round development. But what happens if instead of consciously attempting to subordinate the defect of self-interest by building solidarity among members of society, you attempt instead to build on the defect? Consider in this respect the experience with Yugoslav self-management. Looking at the Soviet model, in 1949, Yugoslav leadership described it as state capitalism and bureaucratic despotism. And they argued that bureaucracy in the Soviet Union had become a new class. State ownership, they declared, was only a precondition of socialism. For socialism, the argument was, you need socialist relations of production, in other words, self-management. Without worker management, the argument went, there is no socialism, which, incidentally, Chavez has said recently. Accordingly, in Yugoslavia, a process was begun to develop worker-managed enterprises based upon social ownership of the means of production. And certainly, without question, the extreme alienation characteristic of the Soviet workplace was not to be found. But something went wrong. In the end, there was neither social production organized by workers nor social ownership of the means of production. So what had happened? For one, in the absence of a sustained effort to educate workers in the workplace as to how to run their enterprises, the distinction between thinking and doing remained. Although workers had the power to decide on critical investments, such as in questions like investments, marketing, and production, the workers' councils did not feel they had the competence to make these decisions compared with the management and the technical experts. So they tended to rubber stamp proposals that came from the managers. Why weren't the workers real self-managers? A very important part of the problem is the context in which these self-managed enterprises existed. They functioned in the market and were driven by one thing, self-interest. When maximizing income per worker, rather than the development of the human capacity, is the goal, the Yugoslav experience shows that it may be logical to rely upon experts who promise to take workers to that goal. The result is to undermine worker management and to ensure that workers themselves do not develop their potential. Further, the emphasis upon self-interest necessarily affects solidarity. If the goal of worker management is cooperation among a specific group of producers for their self-interest, then who is the other? Other groups of workers who are competing, other producers who are selling required inputs, other members of society who are your market or who assert a claim on your means of production or upon the results of your labor, those who would tax you, the state. Everyone else is the other. How do you build solidarity in a society on that basis? The focus upon self-interest also infected the concept of social property. While these enterprises were legally property of the state and were viewed as social property, there was differential access to particular means of production. Some workers possessed much better means of production than other workers. And the unemployed, a growing number because of the machine-intensive investments made by enterprises, the unemployed obviously had no access to the means of production at all, so they went and worked as guest workers in Western Europe. Growing inequality in Yugoslavia was the product of monopoly, the ability to exclude others from particular means of production. Rather than social property, what existed was group property. Branko Horvat, one of the leading Croatian economists and one of the great socialist economists, talked about this quite a bit, about the whole concept of what he called technological rent. This whole way in which some people have access to particular means of production and therefore are gaining. But it's not unique to the market, a market case, because the same thing is true in Cuba, for example. It's much better to be working in a hotel than in a sugar mill. You have differential access to means of production. So, despite measures and constitutional changes introduced to strengthen workers against what was called a techno-bureaucracy ruling over expanded reproduction, those measures did not challenge the entrenched power of the group property relation, which is a relation that only on its surface was one of worker management. After all, it was the managers and technical experts in the enterprises who understood about marketing and selling commodities. It was the managers and technical experts who knew about investments, who knew about placing the funds of enterprises in banks, who knew about establishing links with other enterprises, creating mergers, etc. Workers didn't know these things. They knew they were dependent upon the experts. The Yugoslavian case then demonstrates that even with state ownership of the means of production, even with the institution of workers' councils for the purpose of workers' management, an overwhelming emphasis upon self-interest undermines the development of socialism as an organic system. In other words, self-orientation infects all sides of the socialist triangle. And should we be surprised at this development? It's precisely the point made by Che Guevara in his work, Man and Socialism in Cuba. And Che said, quote, "The pipe dream that socialism can be achieved with the help of the dull instruments left to us by capitalism, the commodity as an economic cell, individual material interests as the lever, etc., can lead into a blind alley. And you wind up there after having traveled a long distance with many crossroads, and it's hard to figure out just where you took the wrong turn." I think that's very applicable. So, the concept of socialism for the 21st century as an organic system points to the need to build all sides of the socialist triangle. Obviously, differing concrete circumstances in particular countries means it's not going to be possible to build all sides at the same pace or for all countries to follow the same precise steps. There's no single model, but we have to keep in mind the necessary building of all of these, not putting off some to some distant stage. What this concept of socialism as an organic system, as a socialist triangle, fosters is the recognition of the interdependence of these elements. The failure to develop one side of this combination does not mean that socialism is as yet incomplete. Rather, it means socialism is infected. After all, these defects are only defects from the perspective of the new society. In actual fact, they're integral parts of the old society. Private ownership of the means of production, despotism in the workplace, and self-interest as the goal of production, which I call the capitalist triangle. These all point backward to the old organic system, and they infect the elements alien to them. In other words, in contrast to a concept of stages, in which you could put aside some questions to a later stage, the concept of socialism as an organic system theoretically posits what the experience of the 20th century has demonstrated, which is that the continued presence of elements which not only tend to the reproduction of capitalism, but which sooner or later open the door to its restoration. Now, yesterday, Zizek talked about, a movie, and there are three scenarios. We'll stop and we'll go back and check another possibility. So I have to ask you, we're doing an alternate film too. What would have happened if Lenin had not misinterpreted Marx? What would have happened if countries had not followed this? There are two stages, socialism and communism, and there's the principle of material interest in order to develop productive forces. What if Yugoslavia had not followed this model of focusing on self-interest and material interest with the idea that any suggestion that you build solidarity now is going to be attacked as ultra-leftism? What if this other possibility had been followed? What if that scenario could have been part of the film?